Hello, thank you for joining us for this Fancy Comma presentation series on science, news literacy, and misinformation. In this presentation, we will discuss science literacy, how it can be applied to reading about science in the news, and how this skill set can be used as a tool against misinformation. This presentation will be broken into three parts. In part one, we discuss the connection between journalism and the spread of misinformation. In part two, we discuss how science literacy can and should be applied to reading about science in the news. Finally, in part three, we discuss how you can apply science news literacy, the application of science literacy to science in the news, to protect yourself and others against the spread of misinformation. Science literacy is ultimately about having the functional awareness of basic scientific principles, theories, methods, and facts to understand the major point of scientific information you run across in day-to-day life, to understand how this fits into other conversations, and to make a basic judgment call about whether this information is relevant and whether the source and data are reliable and the arguments and facts as presented make sense. In the big picture, science literacy is about critical thinking. It's about using your basis of knowledge to critically evaluate and validate the value of information you are presented with and the information that you share. Science news literacy is about applying your science literacy to judge the validity and value of scientific information or discussions related to science in the news. This could include discussions about vaccines or infection rates, space travel, cloning, artificial intelligence, genetics research, literally any topic that would make the news. It is about applying science literacy when you hear, read, watch, talk about, or share news stories related to science, whether that news story was relayed to you by a reporter or your family, friends, or colleagues. It is as much about critically evaluating information presented to you as it is about critically evaluating and thinking carefully about information that you are presenting to others. For the first part of this presentation series, before learning how to apply science literacy to reading about science in the news, let's explore the connection between journalism and the spread of misinformation. Let's begin by examining what exactly fake news is. Fake news is so dangerous because it is not always or even most often 100% false. Many times, fake news arises from real news that is misrepresented or misinterpreted. Fake news exists on a gradient of truthfulness from 100% false with not a single validated fact in the story, to mostly false with truths sprinkled in, to largely validated information with falsities sprinkled in or misleading presentation or conclusions, or misinterpretations. The Cambridge English Dictionary defines fake news as stories that have the appearance of news, either because they are designed to look like real news or because the audience misinterprets it as such. These stories spread through all kinds of media, notably the internet, but also television, radio, paper, or even word of mouth. Fake news is usually spread intentionally to influence political opinions, as in the case of propaganda or conspiracy theories, or as a joke, as in the case of satire. Again, fake news often presents itself as legitimate, though at other times it may be obviously false. Some sources of fake news intend not to be taken seriously. They intend to be taken as farce or satire, as in the example of the national satirical journal, The Onion. Other sources of fake news are more devious, presenting their stories as if they are based on fact, claiming to be accurate sources of information, as in the case of the National Enquirer or similar tabloid news sources. Fake news is almost always sensational and designed to stir strong emotions. The strong reactions these stories compel help it to spread so quickly. Once a fake news story takes hold of an audience, it can spread like wildfire. These strong reactions, matched with the rapid spread of the fake news story, and accompanying growth of its audience creates and compounds polarizations around real issues or ideologies that these stories relate to. By using propaganda-type messaging to stir strong emotions and feed into polarization, and because of how quickly these stories spread, fake news can promote hysteria, especially among those who already have deep ideological stakes in the topic and a deeply held belief in the information the story discusses. This propaganda-type fake news not only polarizes and creates hysteria around the topic discussed, but it also sows distrust in the general field of science and social and political institutions. This fake news legitimates itself by sowing distrust in the standard and accepted methods of verifying the legitimacy of facts and interpretations. For these reasons, fake news is a breeding ground for conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories not only arise but are nurtured and grown in this environment of distrust in science and established social institutions. Conspiracy theories are a key tool for spreading propaganda and sowing public distrust and discord. Fake news comes in a variety of forms and through a variety of channels. Fake news is spread through television, radio, word of mouth, periodicals, and the internet. Fake news can take the form of biased or misleading news, satire, propaganda, conspiracy theories, or hoaxes. The major differences between these forms lie in the content, the structure, and the purpose. Though ultimately you can think of these differences as one of gradient of truth, from partial truths to outright lies. Biased or misleading news can arise even among the most reputable sources if the reporter or news source doesn't have all of the facts, or if these facts are not interpreted correctly. Propaganda and conspiracy theories often start with kernels of truth that are misrepresented or exaggerated to promote a particular interpretation of someone or something. Satire and hoaxes can range from partial truths to outright lies. Often, satire begins with a kernel of truth, which is misrepresented or misinterpreted in order to amplify some aspect of the topic, usually in order to point out some absurdity or inherent contradiction. Satire can also present accurate stories but editorialize the meaning, imparting politicized or otherwise biasing readings of it. Hoaxes are defined as outright through and through lies. Hoaxes fabricate events or data and present it as truth. Satire, like the stories presented in The Onion or on The Daily Show, can be an important tool for raising public awareness and engaging broad audiences. However, it can also be dangerous. This danger arises if the audience does not realize the satirical nature of these stories and takes the details or interpretations as unbiased truth. Generally, satire is presented using sarcasm or exaggeration. Satire, by design, presents interpretations or commentary on people and events that are created in order to promote or disparage the topic they are covering, more often designed to disparage by belittling or discrediting. Again, the details of the satirical story may be accurate or based on accurate facts, though it becomes satire when the reporter editorializes the meaning or background, making emotive or politicized statements about the topic. Satire has been used throughout history as a means of spreading information while shaping public opinions about the information shared. Next, we will discuss why misinformation is such a significant issue in the internet age. Information of all kinds, but particularly news, has become more and more available to the broad public at a more and more rapid rate. The invention of the printing press created the first boom in broad public access to the news. The news could be printed in mass form in relatively quick order compared to previous eras and disseminated to the broad public. The internet brought the second boom in public access to news. This new virtual venue for spreading news stories allowed people access to a multitude of stories and sources from around the globe, largely for free, at the click of a button. The internet also created the opportunity for various news sources to proliferate, from organizations and trained reporters to average citizens. Unfortunately, this proliferation of news sources, stories, and interpretations of events has also created space for fake news to proliferate. Today, news comes from a multitude of sources, many of which are not official news outlets. Of course, official news outlets like CNN, MSNBC, or BBC, as well as official organizations and elected representatives are still among those providing access to news stories. News is also shared through unofficial channels like social media, YouTube, and non-expert blogs. Many of the news stories shared on these unofficial channels come from official news sources. However, when shared in a venue such as social media or blogs, these news stories are filtered through the lens of regular people and are often accompanied by non-expert commentary or interpretations that can be biased. Social media is a key source of information for many people. Unfortunately, social media is also a major source for the spread of fake news, particularly conspiracy theories. The rise of what's called citizen journalism has had both positive and negative effects. On the one hand, the ability of average citizens to document and share news from around the globe has allowed for greater, unfiltered access to information about important global events. However, unfortunately, it has also created space for the creation and spread of unvalidated reporting. These unvalidated stories can propel conspiracy theories and other forms of fake news. One of the major reasons why news stories spread so quickly through unofficial channels like social media and blogs is because these stories are presented in a way that draws in and speaks to the broad public. Unfortunately, many legitimate news sources, specifically official organizations and political leaders, are often unable or unwilling to meet the public where they are, often using language or concepts that are too complex and failing to make them comprehensible. Or these official sources present information in a venue that does not allow space for public participation and input. This reluctance to fact check, or the lack of news literacy sufficient to know how to fact check, is made worse in the internet age because unofficial news sources like social media and blogs rarely, if ever, require that stories be fact checked before they are disseminated on these sites. Some major outlets like Twitter and Facebook are trying to move toward requiring public warnings if stories covering major topics such as COVID-19 contain information that contradicts accepted facts. They are also moving towards banning users who are particularly prominent in spreading fake news. However, these warnings and banning these users do not keep people altogether from posting or sharing these stories. Unfortunately, even with warnings, these fake news stories still spread like wildfire. In general, popular news stories tend to spread more rapidly. This is especially the case for unofficial sites like social media, YouTube, and blogs. Retweets, shares, and likes increase the visibility and indicate the popularity of these stories. Unfortunately, popularity in these cases does not indicate validity. The popularity derives from the level of interest that people have in the topic of the story and whether it is presented in an engaging and emotionally stimulating way. However, these indications of popularity and emotional stimulation are often mistaken as indications of validity. This becomes an even greater issue given the proliferation of clickbait stories, which are designed to drive views regardless of the validity of the information they are presenting. These clickbait stories, because they draw attention and are often spread rapidly without verification of the facts presented, are one of the main ways that fake news is able to spread like wildfire through unofficial channels. Finally, In the third section of the first part of the presentation on science news literacy and misinformation, we will talk about how something called confirmation bias plays into our susceptibility to misinformation and feeds into its spread. One of the major reasons why fake news like propaganda, conspiracy theories, and hoaxes are able to spread so widely and quickly is because of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias can have a very strong effect on perceptions of truth and validity. Confirmation bias is the mental process where people are more likely to believe and to remember information that reinforces the beliefs or perceptions that they already hold. The stronger someone's belief, or the more significant their personal experiences, the less likely they are to accept counter evidence, regardless of whether it is validated, reinforced, or even obviously accurate. In the internet age, we are bombarded with a cacophony of news stories and alternative interpretations of any one source of information. Today, compared to previous generations, people have lower faith in fundamental and historically trusted social institutions like government, law, education, and science. The multitude of alternative and often contradictory interpretations that people are faced with often runs counter to the information or stories we are hearing from these social institutions and official sources. Today, more than in previous eras, people are more likely to contest validated information or interpretations from experts. In general, trust in the very foundation of validation, the long accepted methods of collecting and verifying information, such as scientific information, has come to be contested and distrusted. This distrust in official sources of information and methods of information verification, as well as confirmation bias, are exacerbated by the proliferation of outlets where literally anyone, regardless of credentials or skills, can create and spread news stories without having to validate these stories. These unverified official stories reinforce confirmation bias and feed into and are bolstered by what are referred to as echo chambers. Echo chambers refer to the situation in which a particular perspective is echoed by everyone listening because everyone shares the same perspective. Echo chambers give the appearance of validating information because it is agreed upon by everyone in the circle. This is problematic because it means that no one is critically analyzing that information. Social media creates echo chambers because users are able to build their audience and social networks based upon who they share perspectives and experiences with. The ability of individuals to craft their social media environments to reflect their viewpoints and to ignore or avoid counter perspectives leads these social media friend networks to turn into echo chambers. These echo chambers provide support for interpretations and news stories that each user shares, as well as providing other stories that further reinforce these opinions. These echo chambers not only don't introduce critical examination of information, but they provide support for rejecting counter-narratives or contradictory information, even when this information is from validated expert sources. Thank you for joining us for the first part of this presentation on science news literacy and misinformation. In this first part, we focused on the connection between journalism and the spread of misinformation, particularly in the internet age. Please join us for the second part of the presentation, where we will discuss how to apply your science literacy skills to reading about science in the news. In other words, science news literacy.